and climate change as a causal factor and its impact on humanitarian crises is more and more to the fore. And I remember very much clearly many years ago in the United Nations when we started talking about climate refugees, there was a very strong reaction from a number of countries saying, no, this is not an issue we want to talk about. And even more recently, when I was working with Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, and he published an op-ed in the New York Times about climate change as a driver of conflict between pastoralists and herders in Darfur, there was a very furious reaction from the Bush administration at that time saying, no, you can't talk about climate change in this context. This is a political conflict. There's no pure political conflict anymore. The complexity of this is increasing. The challenges are increasing. We're seeing deepening violence, humanitarian disasters from the Sahel to Syria. And the current Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, has talked about mass migrations from Africa and the Middle East that have rocked Europe as a toxic climate security nexus. So climate, instability, conflict, and humanitarian needs. So to dive into these two topics, we have El Haj Assi. You are already a distinguished El Haj, I see. And he's the Secretary General of the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent, one of the largest and most respected humanitarian organizations in the world, especially here in the Gulf, where the Red Crescent is a primary vehicle for humanitarian assistance. We also have Her Royal Highness Princess Sarah Zaid, who is one of the most prominent voices globally on maternal and child health, and her work along with the Red Cross and Crescent. So let me start by asking both of you to reflect on your personal experiences that you have seen in the field, because you have visits to refugee camps, crisis situations. You see on a day-to-day basis how this affects you. Can you outline, and let me start with you, Mr. Secretary General. Can you give us a sense of how you see the evolution of humanitarian situations, the complexity of crisis, and the role of climate change in driving this?
Thank you very much. When we looked at just what happened in last year, 2017, we've counted about 400 severe weather-related, shocks and hazards, in the world that have affected over 23 million people, threatening their lives, threatening their livelihoods and their livestock, as we've seen, but also the ways of lives of people that have to adjust and adapt, and most of them having to leave home because home is no longer safe. It is no longer safe because the strategies of survival that people used to be developing and to cope, those coping mechanisms have been then stretched to the max, and then putting people on the move. And those people on the move, will make the headlines, when they hit Europe. But while I'm speaking now, it is the poorest countries, some of the poorest countries and most vulnerable countries that are hosting the largest numbers of refugees and people on the move in the world. About 1 million in Uganda, but we hardly talk about it. 1/3 of Lebanese population composed of refugees, and it is still not a crisis. 1 million in Jordan, and it is not a crisis. But 1 million in Europe is a crisis. People leave home, and then because home is no longer safe, because they want to be as close as possible to home with the hope, to return. Because like one of them say, well, I can live on my own and then find a way of recovering what I've lost, materially. I cannot live with the grave of my ancestors with me. I cannot live, with also the environment and then the terrain that I'm attached to. And that's where, the environment, comes in, and then the climate change, comes in. While we are speaking right now, Cape Town may be the first big city that is running out of water. While we are speaking right now, we've noticed over the last 40, 50 years that the Lake Chad has shrunk to 95% of its original size, 5% of the Lake Chad compared to what it used to be 50 years ago. But when we talk about the Lake Chad Basin today, we talk about the conflict around the Lake Chad, but we forget it was a lake. And when it is a conflict and what it is originating from, it is exactly because of that. If we add to that, then the rapid and unplanned urbanization, so we are getting more and more into the natural habitat of fauna and flora, sharing the habitat with the bats and then the green monkey. They can live with the viruses and bacteria and survive. We get the same viruses and bacteria and die. Ebola is related to climate change. Chikungunya, dengue, Lassa fever, Nile fever, Marburg. Unfortunately, even in this day and age, plague, like we just recently experienced it in Madagascar. Well, conflicts, used to be related to fighting over mineral resources and maybe oil and diamonds. But it may now be reduced to one simple commodity that we all are striving for and then we cannot live without, which is water, in the centrality of it. We see also a recurrence of climate-related shocks and hazards that are getting more and more frequent and more severe.
Thank you very much. It's a very compelling picture that you paint, and I think a very correct one, because the nature of threats are evolving. But one thing we can be sure of is that they're not going away. The severity is going to increase. And we'll come back to potential solutions a little while, which I'm sure that you'll seize with. But let me move on to Her Royal Highness. Your Highness, you're the UN Refugee Agency's advisor on gender, forced displacement, and protection. And you were recently in South Sudan, which is one of those areas that is severely affected by conflict, where we see drivers of climate, and where we see substantial underfunding of peacekeeping activities. And I just heard from a colleague in the UN that with the current cuts that we're seeing in peacekeeping operations, that operation is going to be hit even harder. Now, from your perspective, what does this nexus and these humanitarian conditions mean practically for security, development, and humanitarian actors in the field?
An excellent question, and firstly, it's my great honor to be here. Unfortunately, though, attending such an outstanding summit means that my thinking is evolving as I'm going, and so my mess is what you're going to have to tolerate, and I apologize if I jump around a little bit. One thing that is undeniable is that climate change is a multiplier effect on the suffering of women and children and newborns. And that in the majority of humanitarian settings, that the majority of the population is made up of women and children. On average, 75% of a population in need is women and children. In South Sudan, it's actually 85% of women and children. And the impact that climate change has is that as the multiplier effect, is that it increases the suffering and also a woman and girl's vulnerability. And this is because it reinforces traditional social norms. So traditionally, women and girls have the responsibility for the family. They're responsible for gathering wood, collecting water, feeding the families. And climate change makes all of these daily tasks longer, harder, and makes women and girls much more vulnerable. Women and girls will take extra risk to go that further mile because they have to get the water, they have to get the wood. This exposes them to injury, to sexual violence, and to abuse. When so much time is taken in the everyday burden of providing, it means that girls have to drop out of school. They don't have time. It means that women are not free to contribute in the way that we need. They are the heart of our families, they are the heart of our community. And if they are unable to contribute to our economies, to our communities, we will lose that. And for women and girls, what this means at the end of the day is that they are trapped in a cycle of poverty and dependency, that this nexus between a humanitarian fragile setting and climate change does, is that it just reinforces the fact that they will never get off the sticky floor. Another area where humanitarian settings and climate change come together, and specifically in South Sudan, is where you have the population that has been forced off valuable agricultural lands combined with the drought that has affected South Sudan and the surrounding area. This leads to resource scarcity and price increases of foods. Women always eat last, they eat less, because they are providing for their families. And yet a woman's nutritional well-being is actually at the heart of what we need for future generations. If a newborn child, from conception to the first 1,000 days, 2 years, does not receive adequate nutrition from their mother, again, throughout pregnancy and until they're 2 years old, their cognitive abilities can be impaired. And this means that not only have we got our women and girls that are stuck on this sticky floor from which they are unable to rise, but we are impairing future generations. How can we talk about prevention? How can we talk about peace when we cannot get half of the population to the table because they are so busy, and that future generations are then cognitively disadvantaged because they haven't had the appropriate nutritional value because of this multiplier between humanitarian setting and climate change?